And joining us now on the debate, Janet Ecker, president of the Toronto Financial Services Alliance, Aaron Weir, economist with the United Steelworkers Union, John Duffy, principal at Strategy Corp, and Adam Radwanski, Queen's Park columnist at the Globe and Mail. I think I'm going to take Andrea Horwath's advice, but postpone it a bit. We will talk coalitions and accords and all that other stuff later. Let's first get to some of the economic commitments that she is making. If we could put these up, Michael, starting with, you heard her talk about raising the corporate tax rate to 14%, reducing small business taxes to 4%, take the HST off home electricity and heating, reduce the HST on gasoline, and cap weekly prices. Tax credits for job creation, training and capital investment, and some controversial Buy Ontario legislation, including processing of natural resources locally. Aaron, I want to start with tax cuts. This NDP has made tax cuts quite a central part of its priority list. How come?
Well, I think it's really about how we raise taxes in the province. I mean, the NDP is proposing to restore a 14% corporate income tax rate, as you mentioned. That's worth nearly $2 billion per year in additional revenue. The party's proposing to use some of that additional revenue to remove the HST from basic necessities, just to provide a bit of a break to ordinary Ontarians and a bit of stimulus to the provincial economy.
Janet, you were a former Minister of Finance in this province. What do you think about the idea of raising $2 billion more in revenue by hiking the corporate sales tax?
Well, that's great if you can get it from companies that will want to be here, because that's one of the challenges, is that if you don't have competitive tax rates, businesses don't want to be here. They don't have to be here. There's a lot of other jurisdictions that are competing very strongly to get companies to locate or relocate there.
Is that enough to make a difference?
Well, I think it is. And actually what is interesting about the platform, which I thought, I mean, this isn't your mother's NDP party anymore. What Andrea has done is she actually has some things in there that do make some sense. I mean, for example, she's talking about keeping the tax rates, business tax rates, competitive with United States rates. They'll never let them get out of whack with U.S. rates. That's a very good thing, I think. The small business tax break they're talking about, again, is a very good thing because it helps the growth of business, and it's business that hires people.
John, you agree this is not your mother's NDP anymore? Different party?
Oh, very much so. I was actually a teenage New Democrat, and this is nothing like the party that I was briefly involved in way back. It is different, and certainly lining up in the same place as the Conservatives in regard to tax cuts, focus on pocketbook issues, is interesting. And you flagged in your excellent interview with Andrea some of the political things about it. In public policy terms, you know, I think there may be some room for some tax rebalancing where this stuff to be implemented. But Janet's absolutely right. You would really run into questions about how much slack there is on the corporate taxation side. The Liberals under McGuinty, as you know, have made a lot of progress in this. It's basically been moving in the same direction as the federal government as well. And what we know is that when both levels of government are sort of moving in relative harmony, they might not like the spotlight to be shone on it too much for partisan reasons, but that's when you get the best tax policy and the clearest signals to business actors. So one of the interesting things, if you were to try to implement, would be the conversation between the two finance ministries, the one at Frost Building South at Queen's Park and the one up at Esplanade Laurier in Ottawa. You'd hope that that went harmoniously. But it's certainly a different NDP approach than we're used to seeing.
Do you have any sense yet, I mean, you're out there on the hustings following the leaders around, whether this new kind of NDP is playing better with the electorate than, say, the old let's look for the new Jerusalem NDP?
It's a little hard to say because they've had trouble cracking through it all, at least the pre-election, in terms of getting noticed. I think it may help them outside of places like downtown Toronto and Ottawa, certainly in Northern Ontario, where they have a lot of hopes of making major inroads, in parts of Southwest, maybe in terms of getting their vote totals up even in suburban areas. If not winning there, it may actually make a difference. Their challenge is that it's not particularly popular among some of their core voters traditionally in places like downtown Toronto and downtown Ottawa, where there's at least a handful of seats they've got a shot at. I guess the question is, have they brought along their base in what they're trying to do here? I mean, that's something federally that Jack Layton actually did pretty well. It wasn't from one minute to the next the NDP changed. It was a slow, gradual thing of trying to become more into the mainstream. Horwath is kind of trying to do it in one election, and there's a danger there that she loses some people along the way.
But I think her position, Janet, is that you Conservatives federally and you Liberals provincially have done such a good job lowering corporate taxes that there's actually a little room to raise them and still be competitive with our border jurisdictions, the states, the other provinces, and so on. Is she right about that?
No, I don't think she is. I think that right now the global economy is in very precarious shape. Canada, who survived the last downturn relatively well, but we're not out of the woods yet. And you can see even Canada's economy, with it, the strengths that we have here, is starting to feel the pain. So I don't think this is the time to start when other jurisdictions are running around, I'll call it ruining their value proposition as a business location with uncertainty around rules and regulations, and especially in the financial services sector, talking about punitive, they're out for vengeance and they're out for regulations that are not dealing with the fundamental problems. All of that gives, I think, Canada and Ontario an advantage in terms of building and growing businesses here.
Do we run the risk of losing that advantage if we hike the corporate tax rates?
No, I don't think so. And actually, I think it's interesting that John has brought the federal corporate tax cuts into this debate, because currently we've got a federal corporate income tax rate of 16.5% plus a provincial rate of 11.5%. That's 28% combined rate that businesses pay in Ontario. The federal rate's going down to 15%, so if we restore it to 14% provincially in Ontario, that's a combined rate of 29%, which isn't much different from where we are right now. So I don't know how you call that punitive.
No, do you want to be raising taxes, though, in these precarious economic times?
Well, the corporate income tax rate in Ontario has actually been going down for about a decade, since the federal government started slashing corporate tax rates in 2000. And the interesting thing is, if you look at business investment in machinery and equipment as a share of the economy, it's actually declined on almost exactly the same trajectory as the corporate tax rate. So I don't see any evidence that all the corporate tax cuts we've already have actually increased investment. And frankly, I don't see any real reason to believe that giving yet more money to profitable businesses that are already hoarding records amount of cash is going to lead to real investment and jobs in the Ontario economy. Far better to provide incentives and credits that are actually tied to the investment and employment that we want.
Okay, John, let me get you to start us off in a bit of a discussion here about the Buy Ontario provisions that the NDP is putting forward. For example, the buying power, obviously, of the province is pretty significant, and whether it's replacing the fleet of cars that every provincial civil servant has, or whatever, the food that it purchases, to requiring people who want to mine natural resources in Northern Ontario to smelt them here. It's all got to be within the boundaries of the province of Ontario, so the NDP says. Is that good policy?
Well, it can be, but it really depends. There's a pretty large global architecture of rules around this sort of stuff. It's called the World Trade Organization. And the first question policymakers ask themselves when they're framing these things is it WTO-able? Which is policy wonk speak for saying, is our government going to get nailed hauled up in front of the World Trade Organization tribunal process if we implement this for being unfair? Now, the nice thing from a policymaker's flexibility standpoint is that provinces, like states and municipalities, are subnational. They're not parties to the WTO rules, and so they have greater scope to operate in this space and do what they want. That's the framework. What's the wisdom of it? Well, it depends. Ontario's mining industry, which this is very much about, is integrated across North America. It is involved in taking stuff out of the ground here, sometimes processing and smelting it here, sometimes shipping it away, sometimes the service jobs are here, sometimes not. It's a pretty complicated, pretty major industry. If you were to try to unravel the existing arrangements, you'd have a heck of a set of problems, and it would drive everyone crazy and probably impede production. On the other hand, a lot of what this is about is the controversy over how we will smelt in this province the chromite strike and the other strike, including nickel and a lot of other valuable non-ferrous metals up in the so-called Ring of Fire up at McFaulds Lake in the northwest corner of the province. Now, there is quite a lot of back and forth on that issue about where the smelting will go. It is the stuff of intense partisanship, not only among parties in northwestern Ontario and northeastern Ontario, but among communities. And everybody wants to see, I know that the Liberals want to see, and everyone wants to see as many of the jobs as possible stay in Ontario on this really important find. So what you'd probably say is, as a ironclad, hard and fast policy across the board, not a good idea, might even be WTO-able, that could be a problem. As regards Northern Ontario and the Ring of Fire, probably a good aspiration.
Yeah.
Well, politically then, Adam, I don't know if it's WT Oval up in Northern Ontario, but it's a vote getter, I'm guessing, in Northern Ontario. When we were up there taking this program on the road, you saw the signs everywhere. Keep it in Ontario.
It certainly is, and that's what I think what we're trying to avoid here is kind of what's happened in Alberta, where you get the raw oil and shipped out, and then it comes back. I mean, you really don't take full advantage of it, and that's been something they've been grappling with for decades there. And I think that's something that I think all the parties here have recognized, but it is a tricky one. And as you said, and as John said, it is an issue even between different communities. When I was in Thunder Bay recently, the Northern Affairs Minister, Mike Gravel, is from there. He's taking heat not because he doesn't want to process the chromite in Northern Ontario, but because he's not pushing hard enough for it to be right in Thunder Bay. So it is hard to keep everybody happy with these things, but I do think it's the right balance. The other fear is you don't want to wind up driving away investment, even just in terms of the mining, because it's just not practical for people to mine it and process it.
Yeah.
Janet.
Well, the other point, I mean, Canada and Ontario, I mean, we're a trading nation. We're a trading jurisdiction. And if you want other people to buy the things that you produce, you've got to be careful that you're not wanting to buy the things that they produce. So I think John captured it quite well. It's sort of an it depends answer on this. And I think you've got to be very, very careful about where you go. The politics of it, I mean, absolutely, from the NDP's position, I mean, I think it would be a very positive thing for her to play. I mean, just speaking up from the politics, but I think it's a very, very dangerous card to play because there are repercussions when you do that.
Well, let me talk to Aaron about some of those. For example, we make subway cars in this province. Why would anybody buy our subway cars in some jurisdiction outside of Ontario if we don't open ourselves up to the possibility of buying their stuff to bring in here?
Well, I mean, I guess this is sort of a balancing act that all jurisdictions have to contend with. And I think the problem is that until recently, Canadians have been really sort of Boy Scouts on these procurement issues and haven't tried very hard to sort of keep investment and jobs in our jurisdictions. All kinds of other countries around the world try to use public procurement as a tool to develop their own economies.
So is it more a bargaining chip?
Well, yeah, it is very much about negotiations. And just to kind of pick up on John's point about the mining industry and it being this big globally integrated thing, well, that's true. It's also true that Ontario has the richest reserves of nickel in the world. So that actually does give the provincial government a lot of negotiating leverage vis-a-vis a company like Vale to say, well, if you're going to take this provincially owned resource out of the ground, we want a certain number of jobs and a certain amount of processing and a certain amount of royalty payments in Ontario. So it's very much about a negotiation with these companies to get a better deal for the province.
Last quick word on this?
You need to be careful about that because the other way that these procurements work and these policies work is if you have the market for government purchases closed and it's only available to Ontario companies, your ability to shop the world for the best price gets lowered. That's why the McGuinty government, for example, has done this very complicated policy maneuvers around nuclear procurement, saying we're open to outside procurement, but our preference is can do if we can do it. You don't want to throw away the opportunity to create price tension in the benefit of the taxpayers in the name of a closed policy that says you can't have it.
You've mentioned can-do. Let's go there next. We want to talk energy and environment promises. And Michael, let's put these up if we can. The NDP's position in this campaign is pretty clear. No new nukes. Phase out coal. Reassemble Ontario Hydro, what I guess is now Ontario Power Generation. Freeze transit fares. Split the operating cost of transit. They've got a cap-and-trade plan that's part of their platform. They want to offer subsidies for home retrofitting rebates. They want to maintain the FIT program, that's the feed-in tariff program for small community-based projects. I want to start, though, with the nukes. And Janet, I'll go to you first. We are 50% dependent on nukes for all of our power in the province of Ontario. If they decide that they can't do, can do, sorry about that, have they got enough in the rest of this plan to keep the lights on?
No, I don't think they do. I think nuclear is, as you say, it's half of Ontario's supply now. It is a good, solid base supply for us. And I'm sorry, but you're not going to run a modern manufacturing and otherwise a modern economy in Ontario on windmills. You need to have a flexible system. You have your base power in nuclear. You have things like gas. You have things like water, et cetera. You have to have a range of power supplies for your economy. So I think it's short-sighted. I think that saying no more nukes is, I think, a big problem for the Ontario economy. Right now, there's no question that between the initiatives that the Harris government and now the McGuinty government have brought in, there has been more power brought online. But what we've really managed to dodge the bullet in terms of supply here is just because of the economic slump that we've had. So there hasn't been the demand for the power that we've seen. So I think it's short-sighted to say no more nukes.
How does that play out there? No nukes.
Well, I think what this really is, I mentioned before that there's a danger of not bringing along the base. This is the article of faith that's supposed to convince the base of the NDP that, in fact, they haven't forgotten about the environment. So they're supposed to appease certain contingents of the environmental movement, downtown voters, that kind of thing. I don't think it's a big issue one way or another to a lot of other people, but I think this is a way of appeasing them. That being said, I don't know how practical it is either. I mean, as Janet said, there's a bit of a reprieve right now because demand has been down. But I haven't heard a practical explanation from the NDP of what happens when demand goes up on this. They talk about conservation a lot. We've seen some fairly limited conservation measures brought in by the current government, and even those have been pretty contentious in terms of smart meters and that kind of thing. Maybe you can do it better, but I can't see that making up the giant gap that would be created by not having nuclear.
Aaron?
Well, I mean, let's be clear. The NDP is not proposing to shut down all the nuclear reactors in the province. What it's saying is to the extent that at the margin the province is making new investments in new generation, we should look to new sources of power, such as green energy. So I think there's a recognition that, of course, Ontario is going to be using a lot of nuclear power for a long time to come. But rather than putting billions of dollars, untold billions, into some potential new reactor at Darlington, why not build more windmills? Why not start developing hydro potential? Why not take advantage of all of these better, cleaner, cheaper options that are out there?
John, where are you on this?
Well, I guess the facts are what they are. We don't have as many waterfalls as the province of Quebec or the province of Manitoba. This is a lovely province. It happens to not have as many waterfalls. We got that big one. We got the pretty one, but they got more of them. Look, energy policy is not really a matter of ideology so much as it's a matter of electrons. These are the laws of nature more than they are the laws of man. The cost is what the cost is. I don't want to slag wind power. As a provincial Liberal, no one can question the commitment of the Liberals to wind and solar and other renewables. But base load nuclear is the broad shoulders that carry the load of the economy on it. It's reliable. It's there all the time.
It's there all the time when it's not breaking down or when it's not
I
having
understand
other
that,
issues,
but the idea of saying let's turn away from 56% of our 54% of our generating capacity. I remember having this conversation with Tim Flannery, who's a great global warming activist, and he was listening to a room and everyone was railing against nuclear, and I sort of said to him, listen, before you go too much further, I don't know if you know that this province is 54% nuclear powered, and he sort of went, oh, that's going to be pretty tough to get off of. And I wish that maybe the NDP, the old NDP, probably would have talked to Tim Flannery and had him at their convention. This version of the NDP is not your mother's NDP.
The important thing to note here, too, I mean, I'm not an expert on nuclear power, but you can't really talk about phasing it out in the sense of it's going to go from 54 to 52 to 50 to 48. I mean, the issue is we've got aging technology right now. If you don't invest in it, at some point you'll have to rely on a lot less of it. You can't just say, well, we're just not going to add any more of it. I mean, the question is, do we want to maintain the level we're at, or do we want to take a big dip in that?
Mm-hmm. And the other thing is that every technology needs refurbishment. And people say, oh, well, nuclear plants are down for refurbishment. Well, yes, wind power doesn't, the wind doesn't blow, there's no power. So I mean, every power system or choice has its upsides and its downsides, and that's when it gets back to my point about what you need is a flexible system that has, your base and your power for flexibility, and yes, alternative energy sources, et cetera. I think there are perhaps better ways to get there than what the Premier's been trying to do. But I think we need a flexible energy supply system in the province.
The NDP has kickstarted a rather interesting debate by offering to cut taxes on home heating oil and cut taxes on gasoline and cap prices and some measures like this. And I just want to read something here from the David Suzuki Foundation, which says, environmentally minded people and parties understand that higher energy prices can provide an additional incentive for people and businesses to conserve energy and invest in energy efficiency. Parties also understand that there's political gold in proposing to bring down energy prices. Unfortunately, like the Ontario Progressive Conservatives, the NDP allowed politics to rule over good policy. From where you sit, is that what they're doing?
To an extent. I think it's hard to defend the gas policy in particular as being particularly good, or frankly, particularly good policy. I don't see an argument. I haven't heard anybody on the policy side saying this is what we need to do. I would say on the home heating, you can at least argue that people are having a hard time making ends meet. There's different ways of approaching that. I think there's a problem there that's being addressed. I don't know on the gas side. I mean, you can certainly make an argument. I don't know that it's really there. I think this is really an issue, and I mentioned earlier they may not have brought their base along well, but to be fair, in more places than not, this is likely to play well. If you're in If you're in Windsor, Ontario, where they're trying to win seats, or if you're in Northern Ontario or all sorts of other places, people are going to look at this and say, my costs are too high, I'm getting squeezed too much, and this could help. Now, whether they'll go to the NDP on that is a different question.
Yes,
I mean, if you're feeling squeezed, you might be more inclined to look to the
Hold
right.
off on that question for a second. I mean, when you were Minister of Finance, I'm sure you looked at trying to cap gas prices or take the price, take the tax off gas just to see if it would help give you a little bump. You looked at it. Can you do it?
No, I mean, I think...
You really can't do it.
But I think, though, what both Mr. Hudak and Ms. Horwath are responding to is, as Adam said, is that we've got a lot of, to use the phrase, sort of Ontario working families out there that are feeling a lot of the pressure.
What if I hear that phrase one more time?
I know. All right, Mr. and Mrs. Front Porch,
There
if
you
that
go.
makes
That's
you feel
better.
better. Yes. But, I mean, they're feeling a lot of pressure, and the economy is not, globally, they're fearful. The HST, while it was good economic policy, certainly was very, very bad politics. And, I think Mr. Hudak has been voicing people's frustration over that. So he's responding to it by saying, okay, we'll take it off some things that have really been irritants for the public. So, and I think you need to respond to people who, you have tax policy sort of at the consent of the taxed. If people start fighting back and, not wanting to pay their taxes as they should, if they don't accept that they're getting good value for them, that it's a not good tax regime, you start undermining your ability to have that kind of revenue that you do need.
John, I want you to speak to the politics of this, which is the Liberals and the Greens support leaving the tax where it is right now, the HST on gasoline. The Conservatives and the New Democrats believe in taking it off. We're talking about the NDP today, but Adam's asked a good question. If you are for taking it off, you got two places to go. Is it a bit of a gamble for the NDP to be out there as the quote-unquote tax-cutting party on these kinds of issues?
Well, it's a little hard at the same moment to say, okay, we're going to reduce reliance on nuclear and we'll make up the gap through renewables and conservation. And at the same time, disincent conservation through eliminating some of the taxes that are there that keep prices where you might want to conserve. I think the politics of this have less to do with people voting the issue and more to do with the ability of Ms. Horwath to be able to make the kind of case that she made in your interview today and that you're seeing the NDP starting to make. A lot of their campaign is about saying, look, we're the party of principle, not the party of cynical politicking. And arguing the party of principle as opposed to the party of politics was good politics for the NDP federally, and I think there's some attempt to revive that dynamic. What is difficult is to make that case and position the NDP that way when at the same time you've executed this maneuver to not be your mother's NDP and to some degree to be getting into the political rough and tumble. I think the NDP decided a few months ago that they actually want to win this election, and they might want to do so on pocketbook issues. But in the process, they've taken on a bunch of risks to the politics of authenticity, their ability to present themselves as above the political fray. We'll see how it goes on October 6th, whether mixing it up in the corners with the Liberals and Conservatives on the practical political rough and tumble is going to be a gamble that pays off for Andrea Horwath.
Aaron, just before you answer the question about whether you're engaging in cynical politicking here, as John put it, we should point out you're a kind of an official advisor to the campaign, right? You are on side with the Ontario NDP campaign.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I work for the Steelworkers Union, which is an affiliate of the New Democratic Party, so certainly good to disclose that. I guess what I would just try to be very clear about is the government is proposing to add HST onto gasoline purchased by consumers, but it's also proposing to pay input tax credits to businesses for all of the gasoline they purchase. The NDP proposal is really the inverse of that. Recognize that ordinary Ontarians don't have much choice but to buy gasoline, so take the HST off that basic necessity. But at the same time, the NDP would withhold the input tax credits paid to business for gasoline. So businesses, which do have a lot more ability to adjust their fuel usage in response to price changes, would have a permanent incentive to be more efficient.
It's defensible policy then, from where you're coming from.
Well, absolutely, because what it does is it provides the sort of higher gasoline prices to the actors that actually have a possibility to make investments in energy efficiency, which is the corporate sector, not individual consumers.
So what do you say to all those people who say you are, and John just said it as well, you are offering a disincentive for people to conserve more, drive less, be greener? You are.
Well, first of all, we're offering an incentive for businesses to do that, and they're the ones that actually have the ability to. I think that a lot of people in Ontario, particularly in northern and rural communities, actually don't have a lot of ability to use less gasoline just because the price is a little bit higher. One thing that's very important is to actually give them some choices, and that's why the platform invests so much in transit, to actually give people a practical alternative to driving.
Anybody else want to on this? One last word on it?
One of the problems with focusing on transit is that for a lot of the ridings that she's going after, I mean in North Bay or Timmins or whatever, the transit discussion is a little bit moot. You're not going to get to work. You're not going to ship your mining products, on a streetcar.
Period, full stop. Okay, ironically enough, we've been saying throughout the program that this isn't your mother's NDP, but we're calling this next chapter not your grandfather's NDP, just so we can be gender neutral here. And we want to, Michael, if we could put this graphic up here, because there are a number of promises on social services as well that the NDP is talking about, starting with halving, that's H-A-L-V-E, halving the emergency room wait times that people are enduring right now. The NDP would also scrap the local health integration networks, the LHINs, and they would add 1 million hours of home care. The minimum wage to $11, index it, and more money for Ontario Works. They would fund 50 new healthcare clinics, and debt relief for doctors in underserviced areas, and cap CEO salaries. Okay, healthcare constantly, we saw it this past week as well. Nick Nanos had a poll. Healthcare, #1 issue, not jobs, not the economy, not deficit reduction, it's always healthcare as #1. There is not, though, Aaron, a ton in this platform that deals with healthcare. How come?
Well, it sounded like you just listed quite a few things.
Listed a few things, but you guys are getting attention for things that are really quite far distant from healthcare. Now, maybe that says more about the media than you, but it seems to me that you guys are out there beating the drums harder on other things rather than healthcare.
Well, I'm not sure that that's the case. I think healthcare really is the #1 issue, and it's a big part of the platform in terms of reducing waiting times and supporting home care. And some of the items that you just mentioned, whether or not those have been wedge issues in the election campaign yet, I'm not sure, but there's quite a few weeks to go.
So you think it is a vote getter for the Ontario NDP?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think voters trust the NDP on healthcare, and for good reason. I mean, after all, it's the party that introduced Medicare in Canada, and it's always been the strongest defender of having a quality public system.
Is healthcare a partisan issue?
Always at election time, because it is so important to voters. And if any party can develop and press a definite issue advantage in terms of being the most credible on healthcare, it's enormously important. I remember the 2004 federal election, which essentially pivoted its entire dynamics around the healthcare debate once Ralph Klein opened that up and the federal Liberals capitalized. It is, and certainly there's a partisan dimension to the debate on LHINs, where the Conservatives and the NDP have lined up together on dismantling the local health integration networks. I'm a little bit less of a partisan view when it comes to wait times. Wait times have come down a fair bit. Ontarians actually are feeling that. They're feeling it particularly in areas like hip and eye, where there have been new models of how to provide the care brought in. And in fact, most of the research in healthcare, public opinion, shows a fairly high level of satisfaction, not so much with the system as it is, but with people's experience of it every day. The level of satisfaction has come up. So what you've got is, of course, nobody's going to vote and say, don't pay attention to the health system. They want that very much. But there is not a level of rage and concern about the level of health care as ordinary Ontario families and citizens are experiencing that would be likely to turn this into a major vote drive.
That's what I was wondering, because, Adam, we did a program on this last week where we had four different people in those chairs talking about how healthcare might or might not play out in the election campaign. And to a person, they were all saying, this system needs massive transformation. And yet, the criticism on the NDP plan is that it's kind of small ball. Yeah, what do you think? Well,
2 points here. First of all, we're talking about whether this is a big issue or not. I would say healthcare always registers as a big issue, but it's been a while since there's been enough daylight between the parties for it to be a really divisive issue during a campaign. I mean, it's important to all of us, but when they kind of ape each other, it doesn't make a big difference.
That's what I meant. Is it a partisan issue?
Well, it's not that much right now, no. And the other thing, in terms of the change that it needs, look, both the Tories and the Liberals have bought into the idea that you have to flatten the healthcare sort of spending curve at a growth of 3% annually. That's what all the projections are based on. In the past, I think the NDP would have looked at this and said, no, you don't. You have to collect more money, and then you can continue to raise healthcare spending, which we need to do. Now they've basically agreed with the same thing, which is, yes, we have to flatten the cost curve, They're not talking about collecting more money to fund it, that sort of thing. That's not what the corporate tax increase is supposed to cover either. So they're not really taking issue with the central premise here on which reform is being based.
Janet, where are you on this?
Well, I think John's point about it not being political, and yet you're seeing the Working Families Coalition, that union and Liberals sponsored, she said, with a partisan crack, group. But you see them out trying to make this the healthcare an issue by raising the fact that they think, Tim Hudak is going to be, doing terrible things to the healthcare system, even though Mr. Hudak is committing to invest more money into it, into the healthcare system, as we all recognize that has to be part of the answer, not the only answer, clearly. And he's also talking about scrapping the LHINs, as is the NDP, because it's a bureaucracy that has grown. There's a function there that needs to be done in terms of regional planning, but unfortunately it's grown up as a bureaucracy that is sucking up money, distancing themselves from community decisions and hospital boards and community organizations. So I think that there's a serious problem there that needs to be addressed, which you're seeing both Ms. Horwath and Mr. Hudak go after.
Okay, a few minutes left here, and I want to talk about one thing. As I said to Ms. Horwath, we talk a lot of policy here, but also a little bit of politics as well. John, at what point, because all the polls, early days, yes, but all the polls show at the moment, someone's going to win a minority government, probably not a majority. Things can change, of course. At what point do party insiders start having conversations which go something like, if you guys come first, but you don't have enough seats for a majority, we'll talk to you about these kinds of alliances, coalitions, accords, whatever. When do those conversations happen?
Most people don't play poker until the cards are dealt.
So election
night is when the cards get dealt. These types of conversations are very tricky to do. They're almost impossible to do in a pre-election day environment, because if word gets out about them, it's explosive. And so to the extent that that may have been something that used to happen 25, 35 years ago, doesn't appear to happen much now, and I don't believe it's happening at this time. However, I don't want to kill an interesting conversation, especially when no less than Andrea Horwath suggested that we talk about it. If you were to see that happening, one of the most interesting questions would be which items on this list would feature in perhaps a scenario where New Democrats were saying our support is conditional on this. I can tell you the hardest one from experience in Germany would be the No Nukes Pledge. That was the condition of Social Democrat support for the, or of Green Party support for the Social Democrats in 1997. It took them 15 years to figure out a protocol for how to do it without bankrupting and causing blackouts in the country, and it's gone back and forth with whether it's ever going to happen ever since. That is extremely complex and difficult to do. The easiest one to do probably would have something to do with public sector wages and corporate tax cuts. You can see a natural link in the NDP mind on that. That might be part of it, but this is just pure speculation. We're just really having fun here.
It is, but 25 years ago it was real.
Yeah.
And when did they, you were kind of there in 1985, I think you were on the scene. At what point did people start to talk about, well, we're going to have to find where the links are?
Well, actually, it was after the election night. I think that John's right. It's not a conversation that parties, engage in right now, nor should they, and it's high risk if they do. But the other thing that I think is important is that, you can sit down and you can look at the policy positions of the different parties and say, okay, maybe they could get together on this, maybe they could get together on that. But what's really important, I think, is the personal relationships and what's the fit and because that can color any kind of negotiations that go on. And I think what you've got with Ms. Horwath is somebody who, first of all, is presenting to the voters someone who's much more personable, much more approachable, much more likable than, with all due respect, her predecessor. Howard Hampton was not somebody you described as warm and fuzzy.
Good hockey player,
or whatever. Absolutely good hockey player, and elbows up in the corners. But I think, so you've got somebody there who I think is more likely to be able to make arrangements if there are such opportunities there. And so we'll see what happens after election night.
Lucky for you two, we're out of time. So we'll just let the two political insiders have at that. And that, if the numbers stay where they are, we'll have this conversation again, I'm sure. Thanks to all of you for coming in today. There's John Duffy and Aaron Weir from Strategy Corps and the Steelworkers, respectively. And on the other side of the table, Janet Ecker, Toronto Financial Services Alliance, and Adam Radwanski, the Queen's Park columnist for the Globe and Mail. Thanks, everybody.